afternoon, everybody. Good to see all your happy, smiling faces this afternoon. Oh, here we go. Got a hand out. So we're 106 this year now. But we don't have 106 here. Okay, so I can't tell you how happy I am that so many people are interested in the American Revolution. Here's a handout for you. So what I'm going to try to do over the next 10 weeks is tell you the same story 10 different times in 10 different ways from 10 different viewpoints. And as I was reading up on all of these characters, I thought, you know, I've never done something like this before. Oh, there you go. Handouts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more time.
Oh. Here we go. There's the handout. And so, in reading up on all these characters, I thought, you know, this is something that I've never seen done before. The same story from 10 different angles, especially a story like this, the American Revolution. And I'd just like to say, too, the American Revolution, as John Adams said, the American Revolution was not just the war. John Adams' viewpoint was the American Revolution took place before the war started. And as we talk about this, you'll see what he means. Benjamin Franklin. It is an absolute crime that I'm only going to spend a little over an hour talking about Benjamin Franklin. There is so much to this guy's life that it's amazing it was only one life. He accomplished so much in his long life. It's truly amazing. So what I'm going to do, starting off, let's get this right. So there are a lot of really good books on Benjamin Franklin. And I'll tell you what, you'd have to be a pretty talented writer to write a boring book about this man. It would be very difficult. So here's a few of them that I happen to have. The first one, if you want a short read, Vernon Crane, Benjamin Franklin. To be honest with you, I didn't like this as much as I thought I would. I usually like reading short biographies, get it done in a day or two, and you get a lot of information. I didn't really like this guy's style because he jumps around chronologically a lot on the same page. I'm a very linear person, and it kind of messed with me. But anyway, it is still a good short biography. If you want to read one of the greatest autobiographies ever written, you got to read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. How many people have read that? Oh, very good, very good. It's a wonderful read. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover his whole life. It only covers up through his 40s or so. It's a crying shame that he didn't finish it. The next one, Stealing God's Thunder. As you might imagine, it's about his electrical experiments. And I like this book, but I like the analogy. It's kind of like Winnie the Pooh. It's a bit stuffed with fluff. So this guy knows how to write several pages of stuff that don't really tell you a whole lot. So it's a type of book that's a good book, but it didn't need to be 276 pages. He could have done the same thing in a lot less. But anyway, it's still a good book. Gordon S. Wood, a very prominent revolutionary historian. The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin, a good read. He wrote this book to show that Benjamin Franklin was not as popular in his own day as many people believe him to be. We think back on him and how celebrated he was, and he was. But he had enemies as well, and at some points in his life, he was not entirely as popular as we remember him. This next one is really good. The Great Improvisation is only about his years in France as an ambassador. So it's a lot of information on about a relatively short period of time. And it's a good period to look at too, because there's a lot interesting things happening at that time. Walter Isaacson. I liked this book the best.
Yes.
It came out in '03, I think. Walter Isaacson has become a very popular biographer. He's done a number of other very famous characters. Was it Da Vinci that he did last? Yeah. So very popular, a good read. But the next one is very good also. Here's a handout for you. The next one is excellent as well. This came out in the year 2000, I think. Brands. It's a bit longer, has a lot of information in it, over 700 pages, but still a very entertaining read. The last one is something I happened to find in a used bookstore just by chance. You can get it on Amazon, but it is absolutely fantastic. Poor Richard's Almanac. That's how he became. How he got his money early on in his life. That's how he could retire at a very young age, in his 40s, and pursue his dreams of scientific research. But very entertaining reading, and I'll get into that a little later. So, Ben Franklin, born January 17th, 1706. He was the 16th of 17 children. Now, that's with 2 women. The first one died after, I think, 7, and the next one had 10, or it was maybe the other way around, I forget. Still a lot of kids. So his father was a soap maker and a candle maker. That's how he earned his money. But he was also known as the guy that you come to for advice in town. This is in Boston, and he was known as a pretty smart guy that a lot of people would go to for advice, and a pretty sharp guy, as you might imagine Ben Franklin's father should be. Here is his birthplace, Milk Street in Boston. Has anybody gone to see this? Is it still standing, or is there a plaque there or something? I know. There's a plaque there? Okay. I figured there'd be something there to show Ben Franklin's birthplace. At a very young age, he was seen to be a prodigy. Very intelligent little kid. He loved to read, he loved to explore and question things. He was the leader of his local gang of boys. They'd go swimming. He was very athletic. He loved to swim. And one of his early experiments was going out onto a pond, and he made a kite, and he had the kite pull him across the pond on a windy day. One of the anecdotes, and I tell you what, I could spend an hour just talking about the anecdotes that are hilarious with Ben Franklin, but they early on thought that he might be a good clergyman. Intelligent young boys are often thought in those days, well, he should be a clergyman. But they realized that this may not be the right thing for him, because one day his father was storing up all the salted meat in the cellar or wherever they were keeping it. And Ben, he took a look at all this meat that they're going to be eating for the winter. And he told his dad, "Hey Dad, how about if we pray over all this meat now? That way we don't have to say grace over it all winter. It'll save time." And his dad No, son, you don't get the point here. He only had 2 years of formal schooling, up through about the age of 10, and that was it. For a short time, he wanted to run away and go out to sea like many young boys who are seeking adventures do, but his father talked him out of that because he had one of his older brothers do that, and I think died at sea, and so his father was not keen on him doing that as well. So instead, at the age of 12, he became an apprentice to his older brother, who was 21 at the time, and quite fortuitously, his brother was in the printing trade, who had books that he would print and newspapers and other things for people in the local neighborhood. So this was a great thing, and he loved the fact that he had access to lots of books, and he loved reading, to the point where he became educated enough as a teenager. At the age of 15, his older brother he did not get along with at all. His older brother was kind of domineering, and I like this word. His older brother said that he was behaving in a saucy manner. He's a saucy boy. I don't know why we don't use that word anymore, because that's really good. So Ben wanted to print some of his own stories, but he knew his brother would not like that idea, so he wrote stories, and he'd slip them under the door at night, and his brother would find them. And his brother would read and say, hey, this is a great story. Who knows who wrote it? Probably some very well-educated adult. And so he printed some of his stories, and was not too pleased when he eventually found out that it was Ben, his younger, saucy brother, that wrote them. He became quite a scholar on his own. Initially he read a lot of sermons, very religious, as you know, town of Boston, but he also read widely in history that he could come across, Plutarch's Lives, travel stories, science, of course, and a lot of moral essays. Boston was a very moral town, and there was many pastors, clergymen who would write moral essays. The most famous of which, who was still alive at this time, was Cotton Mather. How many of you know who Cotton Mather is? Oh, wonderful. He was still alive, and he knew the Franklin family. So he modeled some of his do-good essays on Cotton Mather's works. But he also learned satire. Jonathan Swift. We all know Jonathan Swift, right? You cannot be or consider yourself a truly educated person unless you have read what? Thank you. Gulliver's Travels. But also Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, who wrote The Spectator, a paper that came out in England, and it was only for about a year or so, maybe a year and a half in England, that really brought satire and irony to the modern age. These guys were absolutely fantastic, and they wrote in this style that Ben Franklin absolutely loved and took upon himself, developed in his own writing. So here's The Printer's Apprentice. There's Ben Franklin learning the printer's trade. So after a while, Ben had enough of his older brother. His older brother beat him because of his sauciness, and Ben had had enough. And so he ran away. First he was going to go to New York because he had some connections there. He thought he could get a job as a printer, but that didn't work out. So he went to Philadelphia at the age of 17. And after a few misadventures, one of which was with the governor of Pennsylvania, of all people, who told him that I'll support you in the printer's trade. I'll help set you up, but what you need to do is go to England to buy the supplies, and I'll give you a letter of credit so you can buy everything you need. You come back and everything will be great. The governor of Pennsylvania, he was a con man. And basically, Ben had nothing. When he got to England, he didn't have his letter of credit that was promised. And so he was basically a homeless person in London for about a year and a half. But he very quickly, being the resourceful person that he was, he very quickly got on his feet, got a job, and supported himself for a while, and eventually, of course, came back. So he got into the printing business, and he printed a newspaper, and he printed other things for people, and started Poor Richard's Almanac, 1733. And here's a picture of Ben as he arrived in Philadelphia. He had a few coins in his pocket, and he didn't know how much things were worth in Philadelphia as opposed to Boston. And so he came up to somebody, to a baker, and he said, just give me as much as this will buy me. And so he got like 3 big loaves of bread. And so in his autobiography, he talks about how ridiculous he looked carrying these loaves of bread. And his future wife is there watching him walk by. So, Benjamin Franklin never had a wedding. He was married, but it was a common law marriage. Something that you wouldn't expect back in those days, that two people just shacking up like that in a very moralistic Philadelphia where everybody's a Quaker, right? So, Deborah had been married before. Some years earlier, she had gotten married. This was between the time of him going to England and back. She had married, but she married a real bum. And he skipped out on her, left, no trace, nobody knows where he's at. And so, by law, she wasn't sure if she could get married again. So, the law stated, I guess, at this time, that instead of getting married when you're not really sure whether you're still married or not, they could openly and let everybody know we are going to be common law husband and wife. And so on September 1st, I don't know if they had to post a notice or something, but everybody knew they were going to be husband and wife, but they weren't having a wedding. And that was in 1730. Yeah. And right about that same time, another woman had Ben Franklin's son. We don't know who it is. He never revealed who this other woman was. He did reveal in his autobiography that he often hung out with loose women who were not of the best reputation, let's say. So, right about the time he was married, another woman had his son, and he took charge of William. And apparently Deborah, we don't know how exactly she felt, but she raised him as her son as well. He had a son himself with Deborah. He died of smallpox at the age of 4. And this is at a time when you could be inoculated against smallpox. It was a very dangerous operation, but they knew that it was safer than just not getting it. And the rest of his life, he was very sorry that he did not have his son inoculated. He did have a daughter who grew up and lived through adulthood. His marriage with Deborah was, I think, a comfortable one. I think they loved each other, but it didn't seem like it was a passionate marriage. And as we shall see, many years of his adult life was not with Deborah. It was overseas in England or France. And okay, so here's the first painting we know. Here's a handout for you if you like.
Thank you.
here's the first painting that we know of the young Ben Franklin. At the age of 15, Ben Franklin, in this very religious Puritan town of Boston, became a deist. Now, it's a bit different from a deist, I think, as we would consider them today. He made a statement that he believed, his religious or his statement on religion and belief in God was basically that he believed that the heavens and the earth were created by a benevolent being, that he created people, but that the greatest worship, and that we should worship this being, but the greatest service that we can do to God is to help one another. And so he was okay with religion. And by the way, he also believed that there is an afterlife and that you will be punished or rewarded according to how you lived your life here on earth. But that's as far as he went, as far as his beliefs in God. He did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Okay. Again, some of this stuff from his autobiography, he is really fascinated with morality. And so he tried, at one point in his life, in his 20s, he was going to perfect himself. And he went through it very meticulously. He drew up, at first, 12 virtues that he was going to pursue. And he had charts, 12 charts, and he was going to daily check off whether he fulfilled this or not. Now, he wasn't going to tackle all 12 at once. He was going to work on like 2 or 3 at a time. And once he did that, and he was open about it to his friends as well. He had a friend who was a Quaker, wise old man, who said, I'm sorry, Ben, but you're missing something. Humility. The one thing that he didn't put on this list was humility. He said, oh, okay, so I'll put this, now I have 13. And so for a number of months, he kept track, very good records, of his trying to perfect himself and how well he was doing each day. And of course, he found that the more he tried, the more difficult it became. Because as soon as he seemed to solve one issue, another one would arise. And it came to the point where he realized that it just wasn't going to happen. He was not going to be perfect, and so he gave up the whole thing after a while because it was impossible. He organized in Philadelphia a group of like-minded men to meet together, and these were all very talented, intelligent, well-educated men, and he called it the Junto. And it was going to be a social club, but it was also going to be something where they got together and promoted good works in the community, and philosophical discussions about things like what the best political organization is, who is God, all these big philosophical discussions that they would have. And Ben was always very good about his good works. As we know, he started the first public library in America, the first volunteer fire department there in Philadelphia, and he helped raise money for many different causes, one of which was paving the streets so that they're not awfully muddy in the wintertime and horribly dusty in the summertime. And a lot of people caught on to this and said, wow, this is a great idea. And he also would give grants and or loans to young men starting out in the printing business, so that as he grew older, he had connections throughout the colonies of young men, developing their own printing business. There's Ben the fireman. Now I have to tell you about Poor Richard's Almanac, because it's just fantastic. So we all know what an almanac is, right? What's the purpose of an almanac? What do you want? So, yeah. You want the moon phases, so you know when Easter is. It has a calendar. You need to know the tides, astronomical and astrological information, because people were really into astrology. You wouldn't think that in a very religious time such as this, but people were really into reading the stars to tell the future. So weather predictions, court meeting dates, famous birthdays. In one point, at one of the pages, he has the list of all of the kings of England and all of their birthdays, and the kings of Europe, when their birthdays are. Poems, witty sayings, jokes, recipes, stories, things like that were standard in almanacs. So, Richard Saunders was the name of that he gave to the publisher of this his almanac, and so he presented Richard as a poor man who wanted to support his wife, who kept nagging him about making a living. And so in 1733, he put this out, and in the preface or introduction, that's what he says: "Please support me because I need to support my wife. We're living very poorly." But even better, and I'm sure you're reading that, his competitor was a man named Titan Leeds, an older man who's been doing it for years. And so he says, the stars, prediction from the stars, and everybody believes in astrology, that my dear friend, Titan Leeds, sadly, will be dying on October 17th of this coming year at 3:29 p.m. Now, he goes on and says, now, Titan himself has predicted this too, only Titan has told me that his reading of the stars is that he's going to die on October 26th at 11 in the morning. Now, I really believe that it's mine and not his, but you never know. It's hard to tell. And so, the next year, 1734, he says, "Thank you so much for your support. My wife now has a pot to cook food in, and we're doing much better, and I really appreciate it. And I also want to say that I'm not really sure if Titan Leeds has died or not, since last October I was away on business and I couldn't be there to hold the hand of my dear friend as he passed away. So I'm not really sure, but I'm pretty sure that he did, because have you seen what he wrote about me? He called me a fraud. He says that I'm a liar, and he did. But obviously that couldn't be Titan Leeds. That was somebody else saying this. Titan Leeds was my dear friend, and he would never abuse me in such a manner. He had such an affection for me. You should see. So I'm sure Titan Leeds would never print such things about me, so he's probably dead. The next year, 1735, they are much more prosperous. His wife is happy. And again, we thank you for your support, because my wife is doing so much better. And now I know that Titan Leeds is dead, because no living man would print the things that he's printing about me. So it must be his ghost. So now I would like to tell you that this was entirely Ben Franklin's idea. He actually stole that idea from Jonathan Swift, who had done the same thing in the printing business some years before. So, but I think Franklin did it and carried it much further than Swift did. So there's Poor Richard's Almanac, 1733. That's kind of what it looked like. Ben the inventor. I could spend the whole hour just talking about his inventions. As you know, he invented many things. One of the most popular was his wood-burning stove that was much more efficient at heating up people's houses. He had the chance to put a patent on it, and he declined. Some people will say that it's the generosity of his heart. He was just giving this away. The plans, anybody could do it and make their own. And partially, I'm sure that's true. The other part is, anytime you get a patent back in those days on something that was popular, you had to fight for it the entire time you wanted to keep it, because people were constantly challenging patents and just, basically, I don't care whether you have a patent or not, I'm going to make it and sell it too. And you're constantly involved in lawsuits. And he certainly did not want to do that. So, other things, as we know, he invented bifocals. How many of you ever seen the glass harmonica? Okay, we're going to get a taste of it in just a minute here. Which is a really interesting musical instrument. Hand flippers for swimming, because he loved to swim. He had an improved urinary catheter. They did not have rubber back in those days or anything like that, but he developed a way of making it more flexible. So he had a friend who needed one, and in his old age he needed it as well. So he improved the urinary catheter. He invented an odometer. As we know, he became the postmaster for the colonies, and he was going to measure out all the roads that the postal delivery men took. And so he developed an odometer, so he knew how far everything was. And he attached it to his wagon as he drove along, and so he knew all the distances. And of course, the lightning rod. We'll talk more about that in a minute. He improved the street lamps using whale oil. Of course, they got dirty very quickly, and he developed a way of putting the glass in so that it didn't all collect and get dirty so quickly. He had this mechanical arm that he developed. It was pretty much like what we have today. Only you have this thing where it grabs and it reaches things up high. He invented that, many years ago. And he improved his printer so he could have a rolling printer instead of just one that went up and down. So here's a few of his inventions. This is the harmonica here. Basically, he used wine glasses and stacked them all together and laid them on their side, and you have water on your hands, and it was on a treadle that you could make go around, and it makes very beautiful sounds.
You can see it in the museum in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay. Here is his catheter, right here. And this is a lightning rod that was actually used way back then, that was struck by lightning. Here's his odometer here. And his bifocals. And here's the harmonica. Now, last time I had a video, there was no sound. So cross your fingers. Let's hope that this thing works with sound. Oh, God. Isn't that nice?
Yes.
He invented that while he was in London, and it became all the rage for a little while, and he actually sold a number of them.
So how is it turning? Is
So
it
he
like
used a treadle, like a sewing machine kind of thing. Yeah, yeah. The scientist. In the 1740s, as I said, he made so much money from his Poor Richard's Almanac that he could retire and pursue his scientific interests. And electricity was kind of the latest thing that had not been very in-depth studied. And so it was just at this time becoming something that people were interested in learning more about. It's a bit unfortunate that Sir Isaac Newton didn't get into this before he passed on. Now, Sir Isaac Newton spent a lot of time doing absolutely worthless research in alchemy and other things, and it was estimated that he only spent, in his long life, he only spent maybe 12 years of it doing the stuff that we know for him today. But in any case, electricity was something that a lot of people were interested in who weren't even scientists. There were a number of clergymen and other tradesmen who got into it, and sometimes it was just traveling peddlers who could produce a spark and get money surprising people with their little devices. So he became a gentleman in the 1740s, and he used glass tubes that he would rub with cloth, and as we know, you see static electricity, and everybody was fascinated with that. But it was Ben Franklin who really figured it out, or at least to the extent that it was figured out. He realized that it was not something that was not creating energy. He realized that something was being rubbed off of one thing and it was collected on the other. And so he's the one who coined the terms positive and negative that we use today. A little while later in Leyden, in Holland, they developed what was called the Leyden Jar, and it was brought to Philadelphia, and it became a real curiosity because it was something that could produce electricity. It was a glass jar wrapped in foil that had water, and a wire was inserted into it, and you rub it in certain ways and you could get a really good electrical shock out of it. And so Franklin was so good at it that he collected his friends and said, we're going to have an electric picnic. I'm going to kill a turkey with it, and then I'm going to start the fire with the electrical shock that is going to cook the turkey. And so he did. He had this electrical picnic. And through all this time, he was in correspondence with people in Europe, scientists who were along the same lines, learning the same things that he was. And somebody collected these letters together and published them, and he became a great scientific star in Europe. Before he became a big star amongst ordinary people, he was a big star amongst the scientists of Europe. And that's how he became famous even before the whole kite experiment. And so this is the Leyden Jar. You see how it's foil on the outside, there's water on the inside, and then the metal rod or wire that goes in and connect.
What is the metal of the foil?
You know, I'm not sure.
It's not aluminum, that's for sure.
Right. It wouldn't be aluminum, that's true. Aluminum was way too difficult to make. Honestly, I'm not sure what type of metal it was. And then we come to the Great Kite Experiment. Franklin, by the way, was not the first person to do this. He's the first person to do it with a kite, and his was a much greater success. But there was a man in France who was basically doing the same thing, who attached a metal rod to a church steeple and kind of got the same results, only not quite as good as Franklin. But the big question of the day was, is lightning electricity? It kind of looks like it, but we're not sure. So that's what they were trying to prove. So Ben Franklin himself was first going to use a church steeple, but it was under construction, and so he couldn't. So he had the idea, well, how about if I just fly a kite? And he attached a metal rod to the kite, wire coming down. He also had silk thread on it, which was very important. That's one of the things that they knew was very reactive with electricity. It was silk thread, and the little threads coming off of it would stand up, and you can see the little sparks with it. And so he set this up, and it produced, by the way, there's the myth that lightning struck it, and of course that's not true, because it would have knocked him off and maybe even killed him. But no, he wasn't looking for lightning to strike the kite. He was looking for the reaction of the silk thread. And the key, of course, that he put on there, could I touch the key or put my finger really close to it and see a little static electricity spark, like I've done in my studies? And he did. So that was the proof that they needed, that lightning was electricity. And there's a couple of pictures. I couldn't choose between the two of them, so I chose both of them, how he did this. And you notice he's under an awning of some sort. It was raining, and he could not get the silk thread wet, so he needed to be in a dry place. And the other thing is, his son William was with him, and often his son William is a little boy, depicted in the picture. His son William was with him, but he was 21. He was not a little boy. And Ben the Postmaster. Is there nothing this guy can't do? When he became Postmaster, he very quickly improved the service, but truth be told, it was pretty awful. So there's a lot that could be improved very easily. But he was an excellent organizer. He established home delivery and one-day delivery, New York to Philadelphia. How many of you know how far it is from New York to Philadelphia? I had to look this up to make sure. What?
90 miles.
So I looked it up. It was about 100 miles, but yeah, depending on where exactly you are, sure. But that's an amazing thing to travel that way in just 24 hours or so on a horse. But he did it. And he traveled up and down the colonies, surveying the roads and inspecting everything, making sure that his riders could get through. And he instituted the rule where you are going to ride day and night. You're not going to just hole up at nighttime, but you're going to go 24 hours a day. So it is truly amazing postal service that he developed. Now we're getting a little more political. 1754, right about the time of the French and Indian War, there was a crisis. People were really fearful of the French up in Canada. The Indians seemed to be restless. And so Ben, along with a number of other people from several colonies, were getting together to talk about what could be done. His idea, of course, was the Albany Plan of Union, which a few of his friends thought would be a great thing. This was not a plan to unite the colonies and just have a league of colonies. He wanted a central government, and he drew up plans for this. Of course, the colonies ultimately were not going to go for that because that would mean they would have to give up some of their own sovereignty, and they just weren't going to. And the Crown, of course, ultimately didn't like that plan either, because that made them look a lot more independent. And so the plan, such as it was, died in its infancy at that time. So Ben Franklin became a member of the Assembly, Speaker of the House, and the big issue of the day was, whose side are you on? Are you with the proprietors who are in England, the Quaker proprietors who basically owned Pennsylvania, a lot of property, and basically had a veto power over just about anything that the Assembly did? And, by the way, whose lands could not be taxed because of their special privileges? Or were you on the side of the people who opposed them, who wanted them to be knocked down a notch or so? So he was sent to England in 1757, and this is basically what he was going to argue before the Crown, before Parliament, to reduce the rights of these Quaker proprietors. And he found that he really loved England. It was a wonderful place, a lot more well-educated people in England, and he hobnobbed with all the best of them. And he thought it was wonderful. He traveled around, he got to know people, he got to know David Hume up in Scotland, he visited Ireland, and truly enjoyed himself. He brought his son William along with him as well. And of course, who doesn't like being celebrated? Travel the countryside and everybody thinks you're wonderful. Who wouldn't like that, huh? He did not fully succeed against the proprietors, but he succeeded a little bit. They agreed ultimately, or at least they were forced to pay taxes on some of the properties that they had. And so he had a minor victory against the proprietors at that time. Came back to Philadelphia in 1763. 6 years he was there. He loved it. His son William returned after getting married in England. And by the way, William, right about the time he got married, had a bastard son as well. So it's kind of like father, like son. They both did pretty much the same thing. But his son was appointed governor of New Jersey. One of the things that he was hoping for when he came with his father, something that he was actually somewhat warned against, because Ben Franklin, although he liked the honor of it, he realized that New Jersey was not the best site to be the governor of at the time. I know I'm supposed to say a joke about New Jersey right now. I'll leave it to your imagination. But he told his son that being the governor may cost you more than you get in salary. And but it was a great honor, and he became governor of New Jersey, and Ben Franklin took charge of his bastard son. When he got back, he was thinking that he wanted to return to England sometime and maybe live there the rest of his life. He loved it so much. He could not talk Deborah into going back. She was absolutely petrified of sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, as well she might. Traveling across the Atlantic at that time in history was a horrific, awful experience at the best of times. And she just would not think of it. So here's William Franklin. The bastard son of Ben became the governor of New Jersey. So he's back to England again in 1764 to again argue against the proprietors. But as we know, other things took precedence not very long afterwards. And Ben, at first, got himself into a bit of trouble, because when he came to England, he was going to argue that the king take over Pennsylvania as a royal colony so that it would not be a proprietor colony. And then you have the Stamp Act, and that changed everything. Lord Grenville, who is the Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer. And at first he says to Ben, as with the other American representatives who were there, we need to raise revenue. That the war that we fought for you guys on North America cost a lot of money. But we're not going to ask you to pay for that. We just want you to pay partially for the standing army that we're sending over there. And even then, not a large percentage. They estimated that it cost for that standing army in America annually £350,000 per year. He was only asking for approximately about $60,000 from the Americans in this new tax that he was wanting. And so at first he says, probably disingenuously, that I'm going to give you guys a chance to come up with some ideas for coming up with this money. And if not, then I'm going to impose this tax. Ben Franklin had an idea. He said, if Parliament would authorize bills of credit at 6% interest, basically becoming the creditor of American merchants, they could raise money doing that. And money is always short in America. And we're talking about hard currency, not paper money, which was always in short supply. And of course, Grenville wasn't going to go for that. He was really wanting to put this stamp tax in operation, and he did. And the stamp tax was a tax on all legal forms, and it was on newspapers and playing cards. And as you know, playing cards are, it's kind of like the vice tax that we have on cigarettes. Playing cards were the tools of the devil because people gambled and sold their souls to the devil playing cards. So they were evil, and you put a sin tax on things like that, like we do, alcohol and tobacco. Unfortunately for Grenville, he alienated and angered two of the most educated groups of people in America, lawyers and publishers. Now, at this time, there was not a lot of opposition to this. There were a few. William Pitt, you might know the name, he was called the Great Commoner. He absolutely dominated Parliament for a number of years, but at this time he was feeling pretty ill. He suffered from the gout quite severely, and so he wasn't present in this in the debates. But there was another man who spoke out very firmly against this idea. He argued against the stamp tax, and he praised the Americans. He's the one who coined the term Sons of Liberty. And so he was arguing against the stamp tax. So people in America saw this and they thought, wow, that's a great phrase, Sons of Liberty. I think we'll take that. So the Stamp Act passes in March of 1765, and Franklin, thinking that, well, it is what it is, we got to accept it, it's not like we're going to fight against something like this, and so he asked if his good friend John Hughes could be the collection officer in Pennsylvania. And he was, much to his later chagrin, because, as we know, there's a great uproar in the colonies, and people like John Hughes were being tarred and feathered. So his good friend Ben Franklin did him no favors. But they did, as we know, they boycotted British goods. And by the way, I use the word boycott. They did not use the word boycott. Does anybody know the origin of the word boycott? I had to look this one up because I realized I saw this somewhere, and I found out that boycott was not a word, it was someone's name. And it was a guy in Ireland, I forget the guy's name now, Charles Boycott or something like that, who and this is the 1890s. They weren't going to buy anything from him, and so that coined the term boycott. So anyway, they used at the time the term non-importation agreement. So doesn't sound as good as boycott, but they didn't have it. So they were not going to buy British goods. And Franklin, as people in the colonies knew, he was close to the powers that be in England and friendly with them. And so therefore he was going to get not quite attacked, but he became very unpopular at that time. But he wasn't home. His wife was. Now Deborah was made of very stern stuff, and she was not going to leave her home. Her family were saying, you should probably come live with us for a while. She said, no. Bring me a few guns, and I'm going to stay here. And she did. So she was a bit harassed, but she stood her ground. And here's some Stamp Act riots. We'll talk, of course, a lot more about those in the future weeks, but this is the official stamp, 1 penny stamp that all legal forms were supposed to have. And here is the colonists' rendition of what they thought of it. So, after several months and Parliament's getting very nervous about this non-importation, and the merchants in England are getting very nervous about it because they're not able to sell anything. People are going out of business. So they called Ben to speak before Parliament. He spoke for 3 hours, presenting his arguments and answering questions, and everybody was very impressed with him. They thought he was very articulate. He presented his arguments very well, and he made the mistake, however, of saying, because he picked this up from other Americans, saying, well, the problem is that this is an internal tax. We're okay with external taxes, but we're not okay with internal taxes. So what you need to do is have duties on imported goods, and those have always been always existed, by the way. There's always been duties on imports, and we've never rioted about those. Of course, we've never really paid them much either. He didn't mention that. They were almost always avoided through bribery and other means. So that was his argument. And since the merchants were saying this isn't working too, so Parliament was listening. So here's the British Parliament, very distinguished group of men. So the stamp tax was repealed almost exactly a year later from when it was passed. Of course, Parliament, having their pride wounded, decided that they needed to put out the declaratory act saying that, okay, we're not going to do this tax, but we have the right to. And of course in America it's like, you can have the right to do anything as long as you don't do it. We don't mind. Just don't do it. And so the Declaratory Act said that Parliament has authority over the colonies in all matters whatsoever. But we're going to take off this tax. The colonies celebrate. They have great demonstrations of their loyalty to the king, and hopefully they are thinking they're going back to being loyal subjects and everything's going to be fine. But of course it wasn't, because right afterwards the Townshend duties were enacted, and there's Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was not the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister at the time was William Pitt, who had been brought back, but unfortunately he was very ill again with the gout, he wasn't going to last a whole lot longer as a healthy man. So Charles Townshend basically was taking charge. He imposed these duties. And what was interesting, though, in a number of these duties, he actually reduced the amount that was to be paid, because he knew that they weren't being paid, first of all, and that they were too high. So his argument was, look, I'm going to reduce these duties, but we're going to enforce them. That was the difference. And so there was duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, of course. But there was going to be a little bit of a change. The money was going to be used for the salaries of judges and governors. Now, initially, you might not think, why would anybody object to that? Of course, the colonists knew what he was up to. The colonists were outraged that the crown was going to pay the governor and judges, and so they knew that the governors and the judges were not going to be accountable to the colonists. They were going to be accountable to the king. And so, again, the colonists revolt. So, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania wrote Letters from American Farmer, in which he argued against the Townshend duties as the whole idea, he said, from internal and external taxation is ridiculous. That's not what we're upset about. What we're upset about is the raising of the revenue, using this money to pay other things, when it should be just to regulate commerce. That's what a duty is for. And of course, now we're just getting into splitting hairs, and the Parliament, nor the king, was very happy about that. But the colonists have the last word. Sorry, we're not going to buy anything from England. All these things that have duties on them, we won't buy them. And so, again, they had to back down eventually. But in the meantime, Britain starts sending troops to keep the colonists in line. And Franklin is now thinking, you know, the Parliament maybe shouldn't have any power over the colonists at all. Ireland at the time had their own parliament. The Parliament was subject to the king, not the British Parliament in England. And so that's where he was going with this. We have our legislatures in America. They should be subject to the king and not the British Parliament. So the colonial legislatures are equal with the Parliament in England under the king. And by 1770, all of the duties were repealed except for one. And we all know what that was. So, in March, right about the same time these are repealed, we have the Boston Massacre. Something I'll talk a lot more about in weeks ahead. But there was outrage in Britain and very little sympathy for these ruffians who are attacking British soldiers in the streets. So, but for the next couple of years, there was calm despite this, and the duty that was on the tea was avoided. We could get our tea smuggled in from Holland, and we were perfectly happy with that. And so, Franklin, who was in England, had some time on his hands, and he started to travel, and he visited Ireland and Scotland again, spent some time on the continent, and had a great time. He was honored in Ireland. He could speak before the Irish Parliament, and he was accepted quite readily there. I'm so far behind. I knew this was going to happen.
We're all happy.
Huh?
We're happy.
Well, good. If you have to leave, I'm sorry, but there's just too much here to be ending in 5 minutes. So Franklin was honored in Ireland, But it's interesting, he was honored in Ireland and Scotland for different reasons. In Ireland, he was honored as a man who was rebelling against the British Crown. In Scotland, he was honored as a great scientist and philosopher. So he covered all bases there. So in the meantime, even though there was a relative calm, tensions were growing amongst the leadership in America. They were developing their committees of correspondence, getting connections between the colonies so they could better inform each other of what was going on. So they're organizing to oppose British rule. But this is mainly the leadership and not the common people of the time. And then Franklin was handed a group of letters that were stolen, that were sent from Governor Hutchinson in Massachusetts, in which the governor talks about the colonies and all these rebellions that are going on. And he mentions that maybe we need to abridge some of these things that we know as English liberties, because these colonists are getting out of hand. And so when Ben Franklin got a hold of them, he sent them to Boston. And they saw this. Of course, they're outraged. Ben Franklin told them, you know, you probably shouldn't publish these letters. And so Sam Adams said, nah, we're going to publish them. And they did. But nobody knew where they came from in England. And so there's great outrage. Published in 1773, there's great outrage, and so just more tensions building up. And so Franklin, all this time, he loved writing satire. And so one of the things that he would do is write letters anonymously, send them to the newspapers, and they would publish them. One of them was rules by which a great empire may become a small one. So one of the rules is that the rights that the home country enjoys should be denied to the colonies. Another one is to treat your colonists as if they are always in revolt. That way they will be. Another one, even better. This was an edict from the King of Prussia that he wrote and was published. Actually fooled some people, because he presented it as, this is the King of Prussia. Now, the King of Prussia, reading his history, knows that Great Britain was originally colonized by Germans. Therefore, we are going to impose some taxes on the British. And to be sent to Prussia. And we're also going to impose some trade regulations on you to benefit our manufacturers. And finally, we're going to send our convicts over to Great Britain for the better peopling of that country. Which is the same phrase that England used for America. So, and some people actually bought this, thought this was actually the King of Prussia doing this. Of course, you know, most educated people realized that it was just a ruse, or, you know, playing fun. And some people kind of figured out it was Ben Franklin, because he was famous for that kind of thing. Of course, in 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party, which, again, everybody is in uproar over. Even Ben Franklin thought that that was going too far to take all that tea and dump it into the harbor. So there's great outrage in Britain, and very little patience left for any sympathy for the colonists. And eventually, Franklin had to admit and own up to sending the letters of Governor Hutchinson to America, because accusations were flying around so much. There's a couple of men who were fighting a duel over this issue. One man accused another man, "You are the one who sent these letters, aren't you?" And the other man says, "How dare you accuse me of such a thing? I challenge you to a duel." And so these men are going at each other. And so Franklin's thinking, I better own up for it. So he did. And so he was hauled before the Privy Council into what they call the cockpit, to be subjected to a terrible harangue for about an hour or so. We don't have the exact speech of the guy who harangued him, but the comments were basically, "This is some of the worst language we've ever seen in the Privy Council." So it was pretty awful. But Ben Franklin was not going to respond. He was not going to answer questions. He just stood there silently. And the remarks about his reaction was basically, it's truly amazing that he could stand there for that long and give no expression whatsoever. But that's what he did. So here's a painting supposedly of Franklin in the cockpit being harangued. So he returned to Philadelphia May 5th, 1775. Now somebody tell me, on his trip over, what happened? This is May 5th, 1775. Lexington and Concord had happened while he was en route back to America. And so everybody's in an uproar. He's immediately voted. As soon as he stepped foot on American soil, he was voted in to the Continental Congress, and he was also voted in to various committees in the city of Philadelphia as well for rearranging the political atmosphere in the city and the soon-to-be state of Pennsylvania. He was, so put on several committees, and he was sent to Canada. Because at that time, our great hero of the war, Benedict Arnold, is in Canada. He was going to take the major cities there and take Canada for us, but it didn't work out too well. But he was still up there besieging Quebec, I believe. And so Ben Franklin, he's about 70 years old, takes that trip up there and talks with the great military leader, Benedict Arnold. He's another one on the list a few weeks from now. So talks with him. Arnold tells him the situation, and Franklin comes back and says, "This is still promising. We need to supply these troops out there, and we may take Canada." At this time also, his final break with his son, who is the governor of New Jersey. He saw him for the last time, I think, in December of 75, and they parted their ways. They actually made up several years later in letters, but they never saw each other again. Common Sense was published in January of 1776, moving America towards independence. Ben, of course, is on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, although it was Thomas Jefferson. They all got together and said, "Okay, you're going to write it because you're the best writer here, and we're all on a bunch of other committees anyway, and we don't have the time for it." So Ben was on the committee, and so Jefferson wrote it, and Ben Franklin was actually gave his input on one of the most famous phrases of the Declaration. Jefferson says, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin said, "Now that's too much. We hold these truths to be..." That was his part of the Declaration of Independence. There were a few other minor things, but this was the big one. He was also appointed July 15th to be on the committee to redraft or make up the government of Philadelphia, the Constitution of Philadelphia. Fortunately for Franklin, this committee was meeting in the same building in Philadelphia as the Continental Congress was, so he didn't have to go far at all. And as we all know, we celebrate that great day that we voted for independence, July 2nd, 1776. So who can tell me why we don't celebrate July 2nd and we celebrate July 4th instead? Does anybody know? We voted for independence on July 2nd. July 4th is when we accepted the Declaration of Independence. And so on that parchment paper is written the date, July 4th, not July 2nd. So all your lives you've been celebrating the wrong day. So also he was sent, things were looking pretty bad for the American military. George Washington had been kicked out of New York, has been chased all across New Jersey, and so General Howe has decided to parley with the leaders of the American resistance and offer them a great deal. And so Franklin was a part of that. There's John Adams, Franklin, and Edward Rutledge were the three to parley, and it came to nothing, of course. They were united on independence, and they say, this is where we're going to stand. We will not step back from that. And General Howe is basically saying, you guys are losing. In no time at all, I'm going to take Philadelphia. I will capture General Washington, and you'll be done. And they said, no, we're going to stick with it. And a little later on, when he came back, he was appointed ambassador to France, November of 1776, to get the essential supplies that we needed from France. We needed an alliance with a big power. That was going to save us, and everybody knew it. And of course, when he got to France, he was a great sensation. He loved the attention, and he got it in spades. He arrived December 21st. He brought both of his grandsons with him. His daughter, who was married, also had a son. And so William Temple Franklin, the bastard of the bastard, was 14 at the time. And then there was Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was 7 at the time. He brought with him. And he was all the rage in Paris. The women loved him. The men thought he was just the greatest thing. And he played it up for all it was worth. Everybody wanted a portrait of Ben Franklin, the famous great man, the great backwoods philosopher from America. And so his portrait, it was said, was in virtually every home in France, at least the upper class people anyway. And he was the most recognized person next to the king himself. And here's Ben Franklin. He had his fur cap and his old outfit with his spectacles. People did not wear glasses back in those days. It was thought rather, it was not attractive at all to wear glasses. And so even if you needed them, you did not wear them. He was going to wear his glasses, and he's going to wear his fur cap, and he was going to look like some backwoods great philosopher. And they just ate it up. That fashion, by the way, with this big fur cap, the women, and as you know, if you've seen pictures of the women's hairdos back in those days, they could be just monstrous. And so the women started shaping their hair like this fur cap. And again, here's another topic. I could spend the whole hour and a half, talking about his flirtations with the women of France. Interestingly enough, though, the historians will tell you that we do not believe that any of his flirtations were consummated. He was in his 70s, and he was probably past his time. But he still loved playing up this whole flirtatious thing in the salons of France. So here's just one example that he flirted with this married woman. And who can pronounce? Where's my French interpreter here? What's that? Brion. That's right. Very good. So he wrote up a peace treaty with her. So Article 1, eternal peace between us. Article 2, Mr. F shall come when Madame calls. Article 3, he will stay as long as she pleases. I skipped a few because they're too long. So Article 8, he will do as he pleases when he's with her. And Article 9, he will love any woman he pleases. It was all just in fun. He also loved playing chess. He was never really great at it, but he loved it. He was a pretty competent player. And so he cheated, of course, when he could. But there's this one anecdote that's fantastic. He was put in check, and he didn't move his king out of the way. And the guy said, wait a second, you're in check. You've got to move your king. And he told them, my king is a tyrant. I will not move him. If he was a good king, his people would protect him. But since he is a tyrant, they will not. Go ahead and take the king. I will play without him as a Republican. It's a great thing, great wit. So, he was the diplomat in France, the foreign minister. How do you pronounce this? Vergennes? 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 Vergennes, okay. Of course, very cautious at first because America does not look like it's going to win. And so they secretly gave some supplies and munitions to the Americans, but we're not going to go too far in that. And then, of course, there was the victory at Saratoga, when we took an entire army and defeated them up in New York. And so at that point, France decided, yes, you look like you can win. And so we're going to join in. They got recognition, they got money, military aid. And so now we have the diplomats, Franklin, John Adams, Arthur Lee, were there, and they often did not like each other. So we have Franklin, who in his 70s was very affable, easygoing, somewhat lazy, non-confrontational. He never liked arguments. He was very patient and he was very agreeable. And then there's John Adams, who was a very hard worker, very direct in his speech, highly intelligent, no-nonsense kind of guy, and very impatient and very moralistic. And then finally, Arthur Lee. He was very patriotic, intelligent guy, very loyal, but he was also paranoid, very high-strung and irritable. So the three of them, you know, they were all working towards the same thing, and they recognized that, so they tried to set their differences aside, except for Lee. He was truly awful towards Franklin especially. And so, the Battle of Yorktown, we finally win the war. October 19, 1781. The king, even after hearing of this defeat, was not going to give in. Parliament convinced him otherwise. After some months after this, they finally give in. And so, the peace commissioners now, Franklin, Adams, and John Jay, Franklin did not want to be part of this peace commission because he knew that these types of things are usually never come out as well as anyone really wants them to, and he didn't want the blame for it, but he accepted it as his duty. And he set the parameters. Ben Franklin said, these are the necessary things: independence, the border set with Canada and against the Mississippi, and of all things, fishing rights off Newfoundland. Very important. The advisable things: Britain should admit that they were at fault, pay a huge indemnity to pay for it, and just throw in Canada for good measure. And as it turns out, we got the necessary things, we did not get the advisable things. And here's the famous painting, the Treaty of Paris, in which the Americans came and sat for the painting, but the British decided they did not want to sit for this painting. So John Adams, Ben Franklin, Henry Lawrence he came kind of late, and Franklin got his grandson in there too. So I was going to end up there, but I also wanted to say, finally, his last great service to America was, of course, at the Constitutional Convention. He gave some input. He was not one of the major players, but he was like Washington. He was like the old guy who was the stable, wise old man who kept people from fraying at the edges. When things looked like they weren't going to work out and compromises were not happening, it was Ben Franklin, of all things the deist, who said, we should pray about this. And eventually he helped guide it through as the elder statesman. So I know I've gone way over, but man, I've enjoyed this. Any questions? Yes? Yes, I have this recording. It will be on YouTube. Oh, I need to write this up. Look up Holman's history. And I have some of the last sessions there also. Any other questions? Yes? Oh, next week is Samuel Adams. Yeah. He was lousy at making beer, by the way. He was not a success. Yeah. See you next week.